I'd like to introduce our folks. Mike Przybylski. Przybylski. He's a retired PhD econ professor. Suzanne O'Shea, retired attorney. Tawney, a retired physician. And I was a director of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. So let me start by a short introduction of the thing. Why the heck? This morning I used the hell. 4 senior friends go on a road trip to Washington, D.C. Why would we do that? 4 retired people go on a road trip. Well, because, like so many people, we felt that the current national animosity had become so divisive and extreme that we are unable to really listen to each other. So what happens is many feel it's less stressful to go into silos like Fox News or NPR. We call those silos. But because things are so stressful, people sometimes will feel comfortable in their own silos. Many people in their silos, the problem feels intractable because they're only looking at their own silos and not listening to the other people. They feel like giving up, that it's useless. The 4 of us had similar thoughts, and we are, all 4 of us, products of the socially progressive 1960s, roughly in that bell curve of the 60s. We want to be optimistic about the current situation in the United States. We do not want to throw our hands up in the air and say to our older generation that we can't make a difference, that the older generation, seniors, can make a difference. So when we heard about the Poor People's Campaign, organized by Reverend Barber, who was born in Indianapolis, to take place on June 18th this summer, we decided to hop into one of our cars, and the 4 of us to drive to Washington, D.C., to see, feel, and listen to what Reverend Barber and the people from around the United States were saying about the national, morally based, nonpartisan organization that he started as a link with M.L. King in the 1968, the Poor People's March that he started. We learned that 41 large Greyhound-type buses were coming from 41 states, full of people, poor people from around the United States, and a lot of people in cars like us. And we ran into some people that we know from Indianapolis that had come by car that were converging in Washington, D.C. on June 18th. We went for 5 days, and we wanted to be there and see it and feel it. We learned while we were there about, and you can see these yellow posters around, and you can look at them afterwards, that there are, by people's analysis, that about 140 million poor and low-income people in the United States, citizens, and their allies. They're sending a powerful moral message in the United States. And we're not going to give up, and we will change the current dark situation. That's what Reverend Barber's The Moral March is talking about, gathering people. Thousands, tens of thousands of people were there on June 18th when we were there. Our 4 friends sitting here are invigorated by seeing and hearing and feeling this, and we're going to show you more as we go tonight. Additionally, we spent 5 days taking a tour of the Capitol, and actually, literally, the Capitol that was attacked on the 6th of January. We had a tour, and remembering our American idealism of 250 years ago, we wanted to feel the people about the building our Capitol and see and feel the idealism, to go back to that. We also visited Smithsonian Museum and the National Cathedral. We're going to tell you about those things. And we had a fine vegan meal that Kay's going to tell us about, too. Although we didn't plan it that way, everything we saw and did in Washington in some way was grappling with forging a better future for our country. Today we hope you good folks will see, feel, and hear the moral basis of the bottom-up Poor People's Campaign, as well as several other interesting things that we did in Washington, D.C. Most importantly, we learned that each of us seniors can still make a contribution and a difference. So,
thank you. So, as Steve mentioned, our first stop on our first day there was at the Capitol. And we took a tour of the Capitol. Didn't see any signs of the insurrection, by the way, but anyway, it was all cleaned up. But one of the things we talked about with our tour guide was the Statue of Freedom. That's the statue, a 15-foot tall statue on top of the Capitol Dome. Actually, a 19-foot tall statue. And she faces east toward the entrance and toward the rising sun. She was put up there, I think, in the 1800s sometime, and she's actually wearing a military helmet with American eagle feathers on her helmet. So sometimes we look at it and think of it as Native American, but it's really not. It's a military helmet. But that is, and she stands on a pedestal that says, "E pluribus unum," out of many, one. This is a picture of the inside of the dome in the rotunda where we visited. And this is a close-up picture of the fresco that's at the top of the rotunda. This painting is called the Apotheosis of Washington. And I had to look up apotheosis. I wasn't even sure what that meant. But it means the raising up into heaven, or the glorification or the deification of Washington. And if you got up close, you could see Washington's there in the middle. But surrounding Washington are various mythical figures that were idealistic at the time. And I'm not actually sure that there's ideals that we always appreciate now, but they were at the time. There is war up there with armed freedom and the eagle defeating tyranny and kingly power. There's commerce with Mercury handing a bag of money to Robert Morris, who was a financier of the American Revolution. But there's also science with Minerva teaching Ben Franklin and a few other things that we might actually agree with still today. That was our short visit to the Capitol.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. And now continuing our travelogue portion of the presentation. Now, this is not a travelogue. I mean, it is primarily about the Poor People's Campaign, but the things that we went to see really do all relate, and I'll talk about how this did. This is the Arts and Industries building of the Smithsonian. It's the second oldest building in the Smithsonian complex. Only the original castle is older than this. It was built in the 1850s, I believe, and it was a very futuristic building at its time, for its time. And so, you know, we get future in there. But much more important than that was the exhibit that was actually on display in this building when we were there. This building, unlike the other Smithsonian buildings, does not have a permanent theme. It's a very large exhibition space, but the entire space is used for a particular exhibit with a particular theme. And the theme when we were there, oh wait, wrong way, excuse me. The theme when we were there was futures. And we thought that this theme was particularly relevant to why we were in Washington, and particularly the idea of futures that unite. Now, I remember, and maybe some of you do, in the 1950s and 60s, we had a very bright idea of the future. We, in the newspapers every week, would be, farming of the future, or housing of the future. When I was young enough in the 50s that I was just learning how to draw, and my main thing to draw was cars of the future. And I would put the dates on there. You know, this is a 1980 car, and this is a 2002 car. And that optimism about the future and that optimism about technology is something that we don't seem to have today, and maybe for good reason. I mean, obviously technology has failed us in some ways, but and they, in this exhibit, they had a lot of that kind of thing. They had one of the vehicles for the sort of vacuum tube subway that they're proposing for LA, and so, you know, they had some of the whizzy future stuff too. But the thing that I want to emphasize is some of them. They had a series of movies. And this was the part that was most directly related to the communities of the future. And this section also was very closely related to Dr. Martin Luther King, as our other rally stuff will be later on. And so only in the darkness can you see the stars, Martin Luther King, right? And these examples, and this particular one was about an inner city community that was progressing through arts and community activism around arts. But the idea that in the darkness we can see stars, that is just so relevant to what we're involved with here today. Now the next slide, unfortunately, that's the last slide. The next slide, unfortunately, is missing, so I'll have to tell you about it. And we've had several technical difficulties with this one. We'll just talk. This was another short film, but it was done of a community in West Virginia. And as some of you may know, West Virginia does not get very good press lately, especially one of their senators. But and some of us, including me, have kind of a negative attitude about West Virginia. But this movie was particularly inspiring to me because it was about a community in West Virginia, one of the ones that's been hit the worst by deindustrialization and poverty. But it's a community that is 60% white and 40% black. And the interracial aspect of this community and this movement and this drive into a better future for everyone was really inspiring to me. Okay, now this one probably will be a slide. So, I guess that's the end of my little piece. Thank you.
So this is our eating experience. Elizabeth's Gone Raw is a vegan restaurant on L Street in Washington, D.C. And 3 nights a week it serves a 6 or a 7-course vegan dinner with matching wine, organic wine. And you can see that the building is quite lovely. It's a Federalist townhouse. And there are 3 of us ready to go in and eat. This is one of our courses. It's called sous vide Lehigh potato confit, and it's got a lot of other things with it. The interesting thing to me about this is that Lehigh potatoes are named after the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, where multiple farmers have found that they grow in very diverse growing conditions. Hope for the future of food. The second one is our dessert. And you can see there's this beautiful handmade gold leaf and yummy looking things. This is called tonka bean tiramisu. And tonka beans are the seeds that come from a tree, a pea tree in Central and Southern America. And I'm shocked to find out that peas can grow on trees and not just on vines. Oops. So, this meal was an amazing experience. From the service, to the presentation, to the food. And we discussed the ethical dilemmas such an expensive meal presents. It's hard to grapple with what we want to do versus what others can afford. Animal-free eating does impact climate change as well as health and can be less expensive than our Western diet. We can vouch for the excellence of the experience. We can even recommend it. It would be satisfying even for a billionaire.
Our next stop was the National Cathedral, and it's one of my favorite places in Washington, D.C. The Airbnb where we stayed was right across the street from the cathedral, so of course we had to go. The history of the National Cathedral goes back to 1791, when President George Washington commissioned Major L'Enfant to create a visionary plan for the city. It was L'Enfant who first imagined a great church for national purposes. Construction began on the cathedral in 1907 under President Theodore Roosevelt. The foundation stone came from a field near Bethlehem. I think that's the Bethlehem in Israel, not the Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, and was set into a larger piece of American granite. Construction was finally completed in 1990, which is making it one of the longest construction projects in Washington. The church receives no operating support from the federal government or any national church body, so it's completely supported by donations. This is the picture of the main sanctuary in the Capitol. That when we were there were many volunteers placing plants and getting ready for the service in the next day. So it was very quiet and peaceful, even with all the tourists there. And the windows, the stained glass windows in the cathedral are really very, very beautiful. This is a picture of the space window. The center of the window contains a basalt rock from the Sea of Tranquility on the moon. The rock was donated by the crew of Apollo 11, and the window was dedicated on the 5th anniversary of the moon landing on July 21st, 1974. The website for the cathedral describes the window this way. Radiations of light emanate from numerous solar spheres. Shining through deep colors are white dots symbolizing stars. The thin white trajectory encircling a sphere depicts a manned spaceship. The artist wanted to show the minuteness of humanity in God's universe. This picture doesn't really even do it justice at all. And this is a slide of the cathedral's prayer for an end to gun violence. That there were several posters like this all throughout the sanctuary. One of the reasons I really love the National Cathedral, in addition to its beauty and peacefulness, is how it grapples with modern life and tries to shape a better future. Again, as the cathedral's website states, the National Cathedral tells two overlapping stories: our walk with God and our journey together as Americans. Whether marching together to build God's kingdom or tripping over our own pride, we know that God walks alongside us and continually calls us forward.
Okay, well, the travelogue portion is coming to a close. This is our last one before we talk about the actual event. But this is an art museum, the Renworth Gallery. It was the first purpose-built art museum in Washington, D.C. It was built in the fairly early 1800s, and the building has had many uses over the years. At one point, it was the site of the Corcoran collection. Many of you are familiar with Washington, D.C. know that there was a Corcoran museum that was part of the Smithsonian, and that was in a different location. But anyway, and this building was used as office space and many things. But in recent years, it's been reacquired by the Smithsonian Institution and beautifully restored. And now it is a museum of folk arts and crafts. And that gets a little closer, that gets a little closer to our theme for the night. All right, this is one example of a piece of sort of folk art that we all enjoyed. In fact, we even enjoyed sitting on it. It doesn't look too comfortable. It's a bench. It's more comfortable than it looks. And the theme of it, of course, is working people. You know, there are handles from shovels. Yeah. And some of those handles look like they might be from the old reel-type lawnmowers and other kinds of working equipment that workers have used over the years. The shovels, well, there's some history in my family. My grandfather was a foundry, and he used the shovel a lot. But anyway, this is one example of art. Another is this beautiful quilt. This is actually a quilt. It's done, the subject matter is a famous photograph from World War I of an African-American military unit that served in World War I. Some of you may have seen this picture. There's the black and white picture in which this is based is fairly famous. But this is a quilt. And quilting, of course, often is a communal experience. Okay, so we have folk and people, regular people, and we have community. Okay, we've got a few of our themes on in here. And it's just a beautiful piece of art as well. Oh, okay, the little detail you can see a little better that it actually is a quilt, and it is just powerful. Now, I don't know if neon is actually a folk art, but the emphasis here, I think, is very, very relevant to what we've talked about and what we will talk about in our discussion of the rally. This present moment used to be the unimaginable future, and many of us are old enough to remember trying to imagine about the future and then seeing the future come and saying, well, it's not what we imagined. And so the future really is unimaginable, but we have to try. One of the most important things about humans is that they have to imagine, and they have to dream. And so it's unimaginable in the sense of we're not going to be right, but the future is going to be both worse and better than we can possibly imagine. And so we thought that thing was important to our overall discussion here tonight. And finally, this is yet another quilt. And my Spanish is certainly not good, but I believe it means another world is possible. And someone who knows Spanish.
Yes, that's correct.
Good. I'm glad it's correct. But I've also heard that there's some connotation that it's not just simply another world, but a more positive other world. I don't know if that's...
It's a slogan for the U.S. Social Forum.
Okay.
Another world is possible.
Okay. All right. So it is associated with the idea of positive futures. Okay, great. And so that's very much what we're all about. Even some of us, you know, the future is not as long as it used to be, but it's still an important part of life. Okay, I guess that's all I have.
So this is the opening to our social mission, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, June 18th, 2022. And it is a mass poor people's and low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington and to the polls. This is Dr. William Barber II. He was born in 1963 in Indianapolis. He's an activist, just as his parents were, a minister in the Disciples of Christ Church. He's based in North Carolina. A lot of the activist news that comes out of there is him on his way to jail. In addition to numerous leadership positions in a variety of organizations, he's the author of 4 books on justice and moral activism. In 2018, he helped relaunch the Poor People's Campaign, which was begun by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Repairers of the Breach calls for a moral agenda and a moral budget to address the 5 interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, the war economy and militarism, ecological devastation, and the false moral narrative of Christian nationalism. It's, as you can see over there, it's estimated that at least 40% of the U.S. population is below the poverty level by the most complete compilation. And Dr. Barber states that the majority of the poor are the working poor.
We have a video prepared by Time magazine that I hope will come up on this TV.
Testing. It's time to stand up, is that right? That's right. Is it time to march? That's right.
Justice is like running a relay. You run your circle and then you pass the baton.
It is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages.
Reverend William Barber is leading the movement to fulfill the unfinished Poor People's Campaign.
We must be committed to building a movement in America that says no more blaming the poor.
Now I'm a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide. Why? They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs.
I worked 41 years in the gold mines. I have black lung.
And I'm from Flint, Michigan. You can't imagine being in my footsteps. I have children who have never had the experience of drinking from the tap.
Poverty, broken hearts. I've seen it all over this country.
There is this deep crisis. People are feeling it.
We are here because we're going to win living wages. We are here because we're going to win housing rights and equitable education and the right to thrive, not just barely survive.
We're on the path to justice. We might not win tomorrow, we might not win in 5 years, but we're going to win. I had worked for 20 years on doing very grassroots anti-poverty organizing, trying to, challenge this immorality of poverty in the richest country in the world. And I met Reverend Barber, who is bringing just a clarity and a vision.
Tired of seeing people pit working class white people against black people against brown people when we need to be allies.
taught early on that there's no separation between Jesus and justice.
I'm here as a preacher because I follow this brown-skinned Palestinian Jew who never charged a leper a copay. So don't even come to me talking about following Jesus if you're not standing with the poor.
We stood on the balcony where Dr. King was murdered and vowed to pick up the torch and carry it on.
Until every vote is protected, until every person is respected, we got to hold it up.
We're re-engaging direct action of all forms, nonviolently, voter mobilization, training from the bottom up. Everybody who sets policy ought to be ashamed, and we're going to put it on the map in a powerful coalition.
Send everybody a note of thank you.
I joined the Poor People's Campaign because I just know that everything that's happening to us isn't right. I was homeless for 5 years. I made choices that got me where I was, but like, what did I have to choose from? There's nothing for anyone to do in this town except get high. I want to give hope to people that have zero hope.
I'm hopeful when I see the people coming together around the nation. When I see all of these movements, whether it be Moral Monday, Black Lives Matter, the fight for 15.
This is Dr. King's dream, people. They are going to hear us.
Our democracy is in trouble.
Reverend Barber was arrested during a rally at the Legislative Building.
Don't stop!
I have a disability. I have severe ankylosing spondylitis, and I've had to learn how to live with that. If I get arrested with handcuffs go on, I think about falling sometimes. Sometimes the pain is very intense. But then I see other people who come on walkers who have other issues, and then I get re-inspired. You get something my grandmama called the can't help it. You just can't help it. Let us march on till victory is won. Once your family enters, there are risks to that. I very seldom talk about them in the public arena. I have the death threat. Some of the stuff that has come in, this one says, I've got you in the dead pool. This is nothing compared to what people in the past have had to deal with. So we fight on.
If we don't address this issue of poverty and low wealth, we will never energize the 100 million Americans who stayed home in 2016.
I will vote.
If you mobilize 2 to 10% of the poor around an agenda, you can fundamentally shift every election in this country.
Let your voice be heard. Get out and vote.
I want you to know that when hands that once picked cotton join hands of Latino, join hands of progressive white, join faith hands and labor hands and Asian hands and Native American hands and poor hands and wealthy hands with a conscience and gay hands and straight hands and trans hands and Christian hands and Jewish hands and Muslim hands and Hindu hands and Buddhist hands. When we all get together, we are an instrument of redemption.
It's better to die having fought for justice than to live and stood on the sidelines and watch injustice have its way without a challenge.
So that march, that video was prepared for the march that was scheduled for 2020 that got turned into a virtual march because of the pandemic. So let's continue.
Yes, thank you. switch okay. The third Reconstruction, the first Reconstruction was after the United States lost over 700,000 people in the Civil War. And so for between 10 and 15 years after the Civil War, the first Reconstruction was trying to figure out how to make the country better. And the black people that were slaves were given rights in the South, and the North, the military, went down to the South to help make sure that happened. That was stopped in 1877 because of politics, and after that, for the next 75 years, we had Jim Crow and over 4,400 people lynched in the United States. So the first Reconstruction was an attempt to go back to some of our original values that were supported by the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The first Reconstruction worked for a while, then it failed. The second Reconstruction, and these are broad terms, kind of Reconstruction, was in the 1960s, but someone started actually in the 1930s with Social Security. But in the 1960s, the civil rights laws were changed. Martin Luther King came on the scene and started the second Reconstruction, and then he was murdered. And we did get progress in the 1960s, and we're a product of that. Most of us here are. And then the third Reconstruction is what William Barber is trying to do in saying that we need to try again, because after the 1960s, things started going backwards again. And I won't name any people or parties or presidents, but things started slipping back, and now they've slipped back quite a bit. I think most of us are aware with the Supreme Court and other things. So now this movement is a non-political movement. It's not getting funding from either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. They don't want politicians involved. So this is the third Reconstruction that's being attempted with the poor people around the United States.
On June 18th, 2022, we assemble in Washington, D.C., alongside moral allies and people of faith and conscience, and make a commitment to organize a broad-based movement that can confront these interlocking injustices with a third Reconstruction agenda to heal the nation, end poverty and low wages from the bottom up.
As an economist, I have to mention bottom up, trickle down. You did? Okay. Anyway, this is not a day, but a declaration. We will change the narrative on these injustices, build our power, engage our elected officials, and register to vote. Poor and low-income people make up 1/3 of the electorate. Our votes are not a show of support. That's very important. I mean, I don't know if I've voted for somebody maybe 3 times in my life. But they are a demand to be heard. We will not be silent anymore.
So the campaign does have 7 steps before the midterms. I won't go through all of them, but a few of the demands that this campaign is making. We demand every member of Congress commit to creating and supporting legislation that reflects the third Reconstruction agenda. We declare that this campaign will engage in massive mobilization and outreach through every means available to us: visits, letters, petitions, candidate forums, and phone calls. And probably the most important one, we pledge to return to Washington, D.C. in September 2022 to join 5,000 poor and low-wealth people and religious leaders, along with 100 economists, in nonviolent, moral, direct action in our next step of declaration and notification of these demands. So now we have photos Now we're going to show you some photos, but I need to start the computer of our actual day. There.
And Dr. Barber refers to this action that's going to be happening in the halls of Congress as a resurrection, not an insurrection.
Good.
Because this campaign is paying homage to the old and the new.
Okay, so I'm on next. Mike risked his hand holding a license plate frame inside the fence where snipers could have shot his hand. He did hold it in there inside the fence, so we took a picture. Thank you, Mike. And this project I started after I retired from the Civil Rights Commission about 9 years ago. I've given away over 8,000 license plate frames around Indiana, and we took over 300 to Washington, D.C. And what I did in doing this 9 years ago, I saw that many cars on the road have license plate frames that advertise car dealerships. And the capitalists, the people that make money on selling cars, use advertising to do that. And I thought, why not have something that relates back to justice and our fundamental values? So I had these made, and I still do, in Ohio. And Jim Wolf over there in the corner suggested the last words of the Pledge of Allegiance, because I was playing with other words to put on it, and I think that's perfect, Jim. Thank you. It appeals to both parties, and I've given a box to the Clinton. Yes.
Do you want me to get some? I've got some in my office. Did you bring in?
Get some out after bit. Yeah, I've got some in the car with me.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Charlie. So anyway, we think that people that put them on their cars feel good that they're sending that message, and people that come up behind the car sees that, and they think, and justice for all, what does that mean? My new website, a redone website, has a place on it where you can write in what you think justice means, and you can tell me you want some, and I'll mail them out to you. So we wanted to take these to Washington, D.C., and this is us with bags of license plate frames, and what Mike and Kay and Suzanne, and we gave them out. And a number of people, of course, don't have cars because they're poor. But I asked them, and we asked them if they know people that have cars, and most of them do. So they took license plate frames, and this is Suzanne giving license plate frames away during this day on the 18th of June. So this is us. We kind of sat down and rested a while and had a little to eat, holding up the license plate frames there. So one thing of really good news that I've learned just recently, a friend of ours told me to check with the state of Indiana's Supreme Court part that is in charge of all the judges and the magistrates around Indiana. and they've agreed and reviewed my website and this thing. They're going to be giving license plate frames to all 92 counties, and all the judges and the magistrates and staff in the United States will get in Indiana. And so they'll get these license plate frames. Anyway, so that's a little something we're doing.
So we wanted to, near the close, provide some of the fundamental principles of the Poor People's Campaign. These are selections. We are rooted in a moral analysis based on our deepest religious and constitutional values that demand justice for all. Moral revival is necessary to save the heart and soul of our democracy.
We believe that people should not live in or die from poverty in the richest nation on earth, or ever to exist on earth. Blaming the poor and claiming that the United States does not have an abundance of resources to overcome poverty, and false narratives used to perpetuate economic exploitation, exclusion, and deep inequity.
We recognize the need to organize at the state and local level. Many of the most regressive policies are being passed at the state level, and these policies will have long and lasting effect. The movement is not from above, but below.
We will do our work in a nonpartisan way. No elected officials or candidates get the stage or serve on the state organizing committee of the campaign. This is not about left and right, Democrat or Republican, but about right and wrong.
So now we're going back to the music.
We can sing it?
You can sing it.
I sang it earlier. This first song.
We can all stand up and dance.
Well, music truly is a big part of anything.
Everybody up.
Everybody up, Joe. Everybody up.
Campaigns pay homage to the old and the new. We think about the then and the now of the movement. We're bridging the gap between 1968 and 2018, which is 50 years of just revolution and 50 years of activism. So we also incorporated a new part that incorporates hip-hop, a little hip-hop aspect to it. So to bring the old with the new. So when we get to that, we'll teach you how the words flow and go.
So your words are first, everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Because everybody has a right to live. You got that?
Got that.
All right.
So then the second part will be everybody's got a right to live, and then you all say to live. And then everybody's got a right to love.
To love.
Everybody's got a right to dream.
To dream.
Everybody's got a right to learn.
To learn.
Got it? All right.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to dream.
41 buses came from 41 states, and there were thousands, probably tens of thousands of people there. You saw pictures of part of it. We were very invigorated, and we tried to convey that. We decided to do a road trip and see this ourselves and feel it, and hope that you have picked up the flavor of that. So in Indiana, there's a Poor People's Campaign in Indianapolis, and we encourage you to go online and type that in and look at that. And they're encouraging registering people to vote, among other things. And those things that we mentioned, we cut that list down to 4 from more. But in September, the 29th, Reverend Barber is going to be speaking in Indianapolis. So when you get online, I'm not totally sure where it's going to be, maybe CTS or Clues, I'm not sure, but he's a powerful speaker. Some of us went to hear him a few months ago at the Pike Arts Center, and we gave away another box of license plate frames. They love him there too. So, and he'll be here in September, the 29th. So encourage people to check and see if you want to go hear him. It's a great message, and so anyway, that's the end of our presentation, and we'll take questions if anybody has some.
So if he's going to be here on September 29th, that will be after the DC gathering in September, which he's encouraging.
Yes, apparently we don't know any details about that yet. They're not published online, but you can go online and look and get more information about that. But this is a national thing from the ground up, and we're very impressed at how organized it is.
Oh, it's very organized.
These are some of the things we picked up that day that we have on the easels.
What's the name of the website? It's called
Poor People's Campaign.
Poor People's Campaign is the website.
Yeah,
.org.
Are you willing to share your email?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, is it on the website or?
My email?
No, the email
No,
addresses.
he
We'll make sure that you have the contact information.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, Jim.
A couple questions. I mean, I get it. Reverend Barber, okay, religious or affiliated, obviously. A lot of these slides referenced religious or Christian, or not Christian, but religious something or other. It concerns me when we start mixing religion and politics. You end up with the Supreme Court that we have, what, 6 Catholics now, and you end up with those kinds of thinking, that kind of thinking that happens. Now, I'm not saying poverty, shouldn't be emphasized or anything like that, but I am saying to emphasize the religious aspects of it, I wonder if that's prudent, because I think it could lead to all kinds of crazy stuff when we start mixing religion and politics. That's the first issue, I guess. I didn't know if you guys have given thought to that or not, but it's a concern.
Yeah, it's a very realistic concern. But one thing that's very central to this movement is that it is a moral movement. And morality in our culture doesn't have very many expressions other than through some kind of religion. Now, maybe we could, your point is very well taken. We don't want to be, brand Y and brand X of somebody else's religion. But we absolutely need to be moral. It's about right and wrong. And so maybe there is a better tie to morality than religion. I'm not, I don't have final answer.
I have a comment I'd like to make. And that, my comment is this: a budget is a moral document. And a moral position implies some sense of right or wrong. And any religion, I'm out on a limb on that, because you might find one that says being poor and exploiting people is fine, but I'm not familiar with that religion. And that's a common expression of morality, just like murder is wrong. Those are common expressions of morality, I believe. I can see that some of it's getting shaky, but from my perspective, I don't see other groups standing up and saying we have to counter things like trickle down and exploitation and greed and those other kinds of things. So I'm willing to accept it and watch it.
So when we heard him speak in Indianapolis, and we heard him speak there, he emphasizes all religions and non-religions. He's not talking about Christianity in particular. He's a Disciples of Christ minister from CTS, and he lives in North Carolina. But he's talking about all religions, and he's focused on a moral principle that really, like Kay said, I believe transcends all religions that I'm aware of. So I think your point is good to question and think about, but I don't see any of that. What I do see is that kind of thinking has influenced our Supreme Court. 5 or 6 of the justices, I believe, are Catholic now. So that has, and they're starting to merge religion and government with schools and things like that I'm not comfortable with. I don't think probably any of us are really necessarily. So I think I'm feeling okay with this, and I don't see an emphasis on any on Christianity or any particular religion when I've heard him speak.
I think they've covered it.
The other question I had was especially for the economists here. Yes. I studied economics too, and one of those slides advocated socialism.
Well, that's right.
And having studied economics, you must have got the hair on your arms raised when that came up, because I understand. Well, capitalism built this country. And I'm not saying that pure capitalism is the way to go. You have to mix rational, thinking with it too. And I get it. But when you start talking about socialism, I know people that come up from Cuba, and they say, we don't want any of that stuff.
Well, and people emigrating from Central America now. Of course, and the word has been used to demonize people since Eugene Debs and since fighting Bob LaFollette in Wisconsin. It's not a good word, and it's not a word I would choose. But what is interesting is that even that is allowable within this movement. This movement doesn't shut out anybody.
Right.
And so it doesn't, the movement does not advocate socialism. Somebody that advocates socialism decided to show up at the place, and they were welcome just like anyone else.
So this afternoon, we were looking up definitions of socialism because we can't decide how it's being used any particular time. So if you look on Wikipedia, you discover that it's labeled as a far left, far out concept. And then you keep going down the definitions, and you find that there are multiple ones. Some of them even say that Suzanne is going to quote her what she said about, she's going to rewrite Wikipedia's definition.
Get it right this time.
Yeah.
She's the attorney.
Well, I think what Kay is referring to in Wikipedia, it says socialism is something like eliminating inequality, or what did it say? I took issue with, I don't remember the exact words, but I just thought this, to me, socialism is reducing inequality. Now, you're never going to get rid of it completely. But I chose to put that slide in here. It was a question to me, and another question after we finished talking about whether to fess up to our extravagant vegan dinner, whether we should put this socialism slide in here. And I kind of thought, yes, I thought about it because I think it does turn people off. The word, obviously, and it raises issues and raises concerns. And if we're trying to get people to participate in this, then why put that in there? And I'm personally of the view that we as a country, capitalism is not serving us very well these days. And we need to get over our reflexive fear of socialism and look at what it actually is. And recognize that it's not all Stalinist death camps, which is what we've been told every day of our life forever. But I think, so that's why I left it in, because I think we need to start thinking about that.
There's something else that I want to add, and that is, thank you, when I was poking around trying to answer this question for myself, I came across an article that stated socialism, all you have to do to be called a socialist country is put that in your constitution. And that's what's in Cuba's constitution, that they're a socialist country. But their economy is communist, and their government is authoritarian. So which part of those isms are they really referring to, that they don't want any part of socialism? And I know I had some friends that went diving in Cuba, and they were told when they left this country to be sure to make negative comments about the socialism that exists in Cuba.
As somebody who was there at the very end of the wrap-up, when people came to report how they were going to move forward with the Poor People's Campaign, and it brings from labor, environment, there's something I'm leaving out there, a bunch of different diverse groups. And Reverend Barber had to remind them several times, you're not supposed to say what you did as your group, but you're supposed to say how this is all going to work together as one unit so we can move forward together. So, it's bringing in diverse people but working for a common goal.
Oh, and one other quick thing. It is considered a social science.
Yes, there's a question in the back, Paul.
Yeah, I think, apropos of this conversation, I think it is worth reminding ourselves that Martin Luther King was a critic of capitalism and not just a critic of racism in the work that he did, and that's where the appeal to socialism comes from. I would also remind Jim that there are not streams of Scandinavians wanting to emigrate to the United States, and yet those are socialist economies as well. I do have a question for our economist. I was struck by the observation over here that there are 39 million workers in the United States earning less than $15 an hour. I mean, often we hear the argument from those who are opposed to creating or raising the minimum wage or talking about $15 an hour as a minimum wage, that will put people out of work, which has always struck me as a fallacious argument.
Right. It's a fallacious argument based on I think, intentionally fallacious understanding of economics. Economics is about social organization. It's about markets. And the labor market is about as far from a free market as anyone can get. And within economics, that's recognized. The subfield of labor economics is far more complex than most other branches of economics because it has to take account of all of these amazing levels of market imperfection, information differences, barriers to entry, monopoly, all kinds of factors operate. I mean, in a labor market, a vast majority of people with very little individual power are the sellers, and people with a lot of power are the buyers. Okay, how is that? That's pretty different from the market for bread or the market for gasoline or anything else. So, I don't know if that answers.
Yeah.
Any other questions,
I want to make
comments?
a remark about the word socialism. I think when words become, for lack of a better word, dirty words, bad words, you have to look at who is doing the demonizing of that word and what their motives are. And that says a lot about, I have some relatives who, whenever I go to their house, they talk about the liberal coming into the house. You know, I always thought liberal was a beautiful word. I mean, it means liberty, does it not? I mean, what's so dirty about that? But anyway, I wanted to point out that you have to look at who is doing the demonizing.
Yeah, very quickly on the word liberal, you know, it comes from the 19th century, from the rise of political power in England of people who were not part of the landed aristocracy. So it basically means mercantilist. It basically means, you know, the wealthy people who are not landed aristocracy. That's what liberalism originally meant in 19th century. You know, that they had some freedom, even though they weren't, you know, did not have the inherited power. Now but you're right, it's about freedom. But that's the kind of freedom